When it comes to making a show as complicated as Doctor Who, you're bound to run into trouble, and I'm here today to detail all of the stories with the worst issues. These detail from industrial actions, strikes, legal issues, cast changes, stunt accidents, director replacements, and even alleged curses. Let's dive right in. An Unearthly Child. Was Doctor Who cursed from the start? What you may not know is that there are two versions of the first episode, An Unearthly Child, a transmitted version but also an unbroadcast pilot. The structure of the episode is roughly the same, but this pilot very nearly killed Doctor Who before it even started. From a technical standpoint, the director, Waris Hussein, found the TARDIS set to be a nightmare as the doors kept sliding open when they weren't supposed to. You could tell he was tearing his hair out behind the camera. Sidney Newman, head of drama at the BBC, viewed the pilot episode in September 1963, and the technical issues he found were the least of his problems. The Doctor he thought was too abrasive, with no twinkle in his eye, the pacing was far too slow, and the assertion that the Doctor and Susan were from the 49th century was far too specific. At great cost to the production, Newman demanded that the whole first episode be re-filmed again, which is the version transmitted in 1963 we can enjoy today. Furthermore, the day before Doctor Who was broadcast on November 23, 1963, US President Kennedy was assassinated the day before, leaving the debut of Doctor Who to be vastly overshadowed by the news. Though despite these false starts and hurdles, Doctor Who was now charting towards the future, despite the hiccups. The Daleks. While the second story, The Daleks, ensured Doctor Who was a rating success due to the debut of the iconic Pepper Potts, trouble was ripe for this production early on. Episode 1 was recorded on November 15, 1963, with not much hiccups in the recording. The next week, however, a serious problem was discovered. The communications from director Christopher Barry to production assistant Norman Stewart, via the latter's headphones, had accidentally been picked up by the studio's microphones, rendering the entire day's work unusable. Whilst this was not uncommon in television at the time, the phenomenon was typically almost inaudible to the viewer at home. In this instance, however, the talkback, as it's known, was severe, and on November 18th, Donald Wilson agreed that the dead planet would have to be recorded all over again. Luckily, their hard work did pay off, and the Daleks were a phenomenal success, skyrocketing Doctor Who's ratings to over 10 million. The Reign of Terror. Landing in what is supposedly the Doctor's favourite period history, you'd think there would be no hiccups on this season finale. You'd be wrong. The director assigned to this serial was Hungarian emigre Henrik Hirsch, a relative newcomer to TV. As the filming commenced, it was already clear to many cast members that Hirsch was struggling. The pace of production on Doctor Who was more gruelling than on the handful of TV programmes he had directed to date, and Hirsch, whose background was in the theatre, was not particularly interested in the material. He also had difficulty forging a good working relationship with the actors, and especially William Hartnell, who was often intolerant of foreigners and could be impatient with inexperienced directors. Hirsch's difficulties escalated on July 24th, when Part 3, A Change of Identity, was recorded. Scenes involving a horse and cart were particularly challenging to camera rehearse, and Hirsch started to complain of feeling very unwell. During a break in rehearsals that afternoon, production secretary Anne Earle and production assistant Timothy Combe discovered that Hirsch had collapsed just outside the production gallery. After Hirsch took a week off to recover, it was agreed that Timothy Combe would assume a portion of the director's responsibilities. Combe was also able to convince Hartnell to soften his attitude towards Hirsch. It's safe to say production carried on much more smoothly after this event. The Dalek invasion of Earth. Even one of the most iconic serials of the Hartnell era had its problems. During a camera rehearsal for episode 3, William Hartnell's back was injured during the scene where the Doctor was carried on a stretcher down the ramp. The actors playing the Robomen and the captive humans had been instructed to break step while traversing the ramp, but had failed to do so. This weakened the integrity of the structure, causing it to collapse. Fortunately, Hartnell was well enough to continue with the day's shooting. As the following week progressed, however, Hartnell was still experiencing pain. After correspondence from his lawyer, the BBC agreed to pay for diagnostic imaging, which indicated no permanent trauma to the spine. Nevertheless, it was agreed that Hartnell would be released, with pay, from the recording of The End of Tomorrow on October 9th. The Doctor appeared in only one scene to begin with, making it straightforward to modify the script. Luckily, during transmission of Christmas 1964, dozens of Dalek merchandise invaded store shelves. Riding this wave, the Dalek Invasion of Earth became the series' most successful serial to date, hitting highs of 12.4 million viewers and making Doctor Who one of the week's top 10 television programmes for the first time. The Dominators. We jump forward a few years into the future and look at the Patrick Troughton era, and oh boy, was the Dominators right with production issues from the start. Writers Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln wanted a narrative with timely, modern relevance. Sought to explore what they considered to be the misguided passive philosophy of the hippie movement. The breakdown stage did not go entirely smoothly, with Haseman and Lincoln being asked to modify their storylines before the script was finally commissioned on February 2nd. Matters did not improve over the next month, by which time the first 3 scripts had been delivered. When episode 4 arrived on March 15th and was deemed unsuitable, Sherwin decided to take drastic action. He and his script editor assistant Terence Dix started rewriting the script unbeknownst to Haseman and Lincoln. Finally, after episode 5 arrived at the Doctor Who production office on the morning of March 22nd, Brian asked to meet with the writers that afternoon. He informed Haseman and Lincoln that they would not be required to provide the final episode of The Dominators, although they would be paid in full for all 6 instalments. It appears that relations between Haseman and Lincoln and the Doctor Who production office improved following the end of the recording on The Dominators. Indeed, by early summer, the writers were working on a third Yeti serial called The Laird of McCrimmon. Unfortunately, matters continued to deteriorate over the ensuing weeks. Both parties entered into merchandising endeavours involving the Quarks without the permission of the BBC, leading to a dispute over whether the writers owned the copyright to the Quarks wholly or whether it was shared with the BBC. A series of meetings was held during July in an effort to resolve the matter. Things became so heated at one point that Haseman and Lincoln threatened to go to court to prevent the broadcast of The Dominators. A deal was finally reached, but there was now no question of Haseman and Lincoln continuing to write for Doctor Who. The Laird of McCrimmon was abandoned. The Dominators was a nightmare for everyone involved, with even some of these issues spilling over into the next serial, The Mind Robber. The Mind Robber was originally commissioned as a 4-part serial, but with the Dominators being shortened from 6 episodes to 5, an episode needed to fill the schedule. Cue episode 1 of The Mind Robber, only featuring the 3 regulars, the TARDIS, a white void, and robots. Unfortunately, as rehearsals began for episode 2, it was learned that Fraser Hines had contracted chickenpox from his nephews, rendering him unavailable for the week's recording. The script already included a puzzle which forced the Doctor to arrange pictures depicting parts of Jamie's face in order to bring him back to life. Thinking quickly, Sherwin rewrote both episodes 2 and 3 so that the Doctor gave an incorrect solution, allowing a different actor to play Jamie. In the subsequent instalment, the Doctor would be given another chance at the puzzle, and this time he would solve it correctly. Hastily cast as the altered Jamie was Hamish Wilson. Despite this production issue, The Mind Robber still remains one of the most creative and imaginative serials that Doctor Who has ever put out. Spearhead from space. As we move into the 1970s and into colour, Doctor Who was undergoing the biggest change it had ever gone through at this point. John Pertwee cast as the Third Doctor with a brand new Earthbound format, promising action, adventure and excitement. What could possibly go wrong? Whilst outdoor filming had occurred smoothly, studio recording didn't happen. The BBC had been involved in an escalating dispute with the Association of Broadcast Staff, with the union complaining of insufficient pay rises accompanying the move to colour transmission. During September, producer Derek Sherwin became increasingly concerned that industrial action would impact work at Television Centre, thereby threatening his crucial season premiere. He and Bryant discussed possible alternatives, and finally, Sherwin approached his BBC bosses with this proposal to make: have Spearhead from space be shot entirely on film, something never attempted before on Doctor Who. Approval for the plan was granted on September 25th, and Sherwin's foresight was vindicated when strike action severely curtailed recording at Television Centre from October 12th. The reboot of the series very nearly didn't happen, but luckily the efforts of all involved paid off, as on film, Spearhead from space looks fantastic. Inferno. As the Doctor is thrown into a parallel universe, there is an apocalyptic nightmare. Filming was certainly a challenge for this story. On April 3rd, stuntman Roy Scammell set a world record by performing a 50-foot fall from a gantry. Unfortunately, this day was then marred when John Pertwee, driving Bessie, accidentally hit stuntman Alan Chuntz while recording the Warp 2 scene where the Doctor tried to evade the parallel world soldiers. Despite needing 18 stitches, Alan Chuntz returned to work immediately in order to lift Pertwee's spirits. Nevertheless, this delay meant that some Episode 1 scenes of Benton and other unit troops searching for Slocum and of the Primord murdering a unit soldier called Collins had to be abandoned. Tensions began to mount between cast and crew during studio recording, and the director, Douglas Camfield, collapsed due to a heart murmur. Fortunately, producer Barry Letts was on hand to take over directing duties. Whilst John Pertwee's first year as the Doctor was enough to convince the BBC to carry on with the series, there were still many hurdles to overcome. The Time Monster. As the master meddles with time itself, issues plague the location filming for this serial. Stuntman Greg Powell, playing the knight who attacked the convoy in episode 3, was thrown from his horse when his mount did not follow the planned route and collided with one of the unit vehicles. While filming scenes in Bessie using a side-mounted camera, John Pertwee and Katie Manning realised that they had gotten lost. By this time, the two actors did manage to find their way back to the director, Paul Bernard, who was already in the process of assembling search parties to track them down. Whilst there are not many issues that plague this serial from then on, they're still fun stories to recall nonetheless. The Sontaran Experiment. This serial was another that was filmed entirely on location and was the first in production to be seen by newcomer producer Philip Hinchcliffe. Sadly, Hinchcliffe's debut on the series had its many hurdles. Tom Baker slipped on a patch of wet grass while filming the Doctor's confrontation with Steyer at the area where Sarah was restrained. Recording had to stop immediately, forcing the abandonment of a handful of sequences, including one in which the Doctor found Harry and they heard Sarah screaming. Baker had to carry back to the nearest car and driven all the way to hospital, where it was discovered that he had cracked his collarbone. Rumours circulated around the cast and crew. Would this and the preceding serial Robot have to be refilmed with a new leading man? Fortunately, despite his discomfort, Tom Baker returned to the production the next day. He was able to conceal a neck brace beneath his scarf and coat, although his performance was severely restricted as he was forced to remain very still. Stuntman Terry Walsh stood in for Tom Baker to the greatest extent possible. A couple of days in the producer's chair, and Hinchcliffe's leading man was already in hospital, but that certainly wasn't the end of the problems that would plague Season 12. Revenge of the Cybermen. Buckle up, this has to be the biggest one yet. For the scene set on Voga, the director, Michael Bryant, decided to make use of the network of natural caverns at Wookey Hole, near Wells in Somerset. Inhabited by primitive man since around 50,000 BC, in modern times the cavern had gained a reputation for being haunted by a Dark Ages witch, now petrified as one of the rock formations. While scouting the complex, Bryant's wife, Monique, discovered several Iron Age arrowheads in the sand, which she kept as souvenirs. Some crew members would come to believe that this precipitated a chain of strange occurrences and bad luck which beset the production. The first event attributed to this curse occurred later in the reconnaissance trip, when Bryant encountered an individual dressed in spelunking gear late one night. The Wookey Hole staff have no knowledge of this man, and Bryant came to believe that this was actually the ghost of an Irish potholer who had perished in the caves 3 years ago. On the first day, the small motorboats hired for use as the Vogan skimmers reportedly broke down. Assistant floor manager Rosemary Hester suffered an attack of claustrophobia and had to be replaced by Russ Carroll, while unit armourer Jack Wells also became very unwell. Elizabeth Sladen and Ian Marter approached Bryant with concerns that they had forgotten to record a scene, only to then unable to find the said scene in their scripts. Matters worsened on the 20th, the same day that several of the electricians disobeyed their instructions and interfered with the Witch Rock formation. Afternoon, the motorboat being driven by Elizabeth Sladen on the pond in the Witch's parlour went berserk, forcing her to jump overboard into the water to avoid smashing into the cavern wall. Sladen nearly drowned before being pulled from the water by stuntman Terry Walsh, who subsequently had to be taken to hospital. Soon thereafter, a ladder collapsed under an electrician who suffered a broken leg, and the final day saw visual effects assistant Tony Harding experience unusual difficulty in setting up basic pyrotechnics. Bryant subsequently disposed of the arrowheads collected by his wife, with the rest of the production escaped the supernatural cloud that had dodged the Wookey Hole chute. Whilst the studio recording went by with very little issues, the episode's transmission was plagued with even more sad news. Between the transmission of Part 1 and 2, William Hartnell sadly passed away. This serial may take the title of the most cursed production of Doctor Who, but we ain't out of the caves yet. Underworld. With inflation skyrocketing in the late 1970s, the sets for Underworld were estimated to cost 3 times the anticipated budget. To save these costs, the cave scenes were recorded using colour separation overlay, commonly known as CSO. The cast and crew found the effects dependent on the story extremely frustrating, especially Tom Baker. Furthermore, actress Imogen Bickford Smith suffered an allergic reaction to the old age makeup, and Louise Jameson suffered throat pain after breathing in dry ice. Interesting how working with no set was considered an issue, when nowadays many movies and productions use green screen. Nightmare of Eden. This title is fairly accurate, as this production was a nightmare for many involved. The director, Alan Bromley, quickly clashed with Tom Baker. Who was a commanding presence on the series, Baker had become renowned for trying to impose his will on the production. In contrast, Bromley had a very old-fashioned and authoritarian an approach to directing which did not sit well with the series star. Bromley had originally planned to record the serial in story order, which had been the traditional way of making Doctor Who up until the mid-1970s. However, he was ultimately convinced to proceed on a set-by-set basis, as had now become the norm. Bromley was ill-prepared for the extent to which Doctor Who now utilised special effects, and indeed for the generally faster pace of modern storytelling. Not all of the scheduled recording was complete, and the mood on set became very strained. Bromley made several changes to his recording schedule, and was uncompromising in dictating how he wanted the actors to perform. An exasperated Baker began to shout insults towards the production gallery. This led to an argument on the studio floor, with producer Graham Williams ultimately summoned to intervene. The situation deteriorated completely on the final day of production. With Tom Baker in open revolt, Bromley completed work on some further sequences in the corridors before informing Graham Williams during the supper break that he was walking away from production. Williams himself was forced to step in and direct the remaining material. By the end of the day, production assistant Carolyn Montague had prepared t-shirts bearing the legend, "I'm relieved the nightmare is over." With blame for the debacle played squarely on Bromley's shoulders, it was agreed that Williams would complete the post-production work on the serial, and that Bromley would never again be invited back to direct Doctor Who. He retired from television soon after. This story was such a nightmare, it convinced producer Graham Williams and script editor Douglas Adams to move on from the series, but they were determined to end on a high with their planned series finale. Shada. The finale planned to end season 17 was never to be transmitted due to a strike action. Whilst industrial action plagued the production during the location filming, the crew thought this would be the end. However, when the second recording block occurred during November, disaster struck. Camera rehearsals went ahead as scheduled on the morning, but after a lunch break, cast and crew returned to the studio to find the doors locked. The labour dispute had forced the postponement of all recording at Television Centre. Although director Pennant Roberts hoped that work might resume on the 20th, the facility still remained inaccessible. The fate of Shada was becoming unclear. 3 further studio days were planned for December 1st to 3rd in Studio 3, but as the strike dragged on, Pennant Roberts' team was faced with a new problem. Many of the productions which had been impacted by the job action were Christmas programmes, which the BBC deemed to be critical to their broadcast schedule. Consequently, it was unlikely that Shada would retain its original recording dates, even if the strike was resolved in time. Pennant Roberts proceeded with rehearsals, but after meeting with head of series and serials Graham MacDonald on November 30th, Graham Williams informed the director that the production was to halt. As it happened, the BBC even reached an agreement with the strike unions later that same day. Eager for his Doctor Who swan song to be completed, Graham Williams continued to investigate the possibility of remounting the 5 abandoned studio days later in December. It quickly became clear, however, that Shada could not be booked into the studio until at least January 1980, even assuming that the appropriate funding was secured. With the serial scheduled to begin transmission on January 19th, this effectively sealed the matter. On December 10th, it was officially decided that the Horns of Nymon would mark the end of a shortened Season 17. Shada was officially abandoned, and whilst many attempts to recreate the serials occurred over the years, it's only a shame that the 1970s had to end this way. Warrior's Gate. As Tom Baker's final season as the Doctor drew to a close, it was still not without its problems. The director, Paul Joyce, envisaged making the serial in the style of a feature film, and was enthusiastic about pushing the boundaries of what could be accomplished on the series. Production assistant Graham Harper, a Doctor Who veteran, became increasingly worried that Joyce was not adequately planning the creative and technical complex recording, and conveyed his fears to producer John Nathan Turner. Studio recording was originally due to begin in early September, but it was agreed that these dates would be delayed to allow for more preparation time, especially since the scripts were remaining in flux. The atmosphere during rehearsals was tense. Tom Baker and Lalla Ward, who had renewed their romantic relationship some weeks earlier, were fighting. Baker had still not fully recovered from his illness, as he endured since March, and his mood was further dampening by the imminent departure of Lalla Ward. There was immediate delay to recording when Joyce's decision to incorporate the studio lighting gantry into the spaceship set drew the objections of John Dixon, who was in charge of lighting. Recording was delayed for 2 hours, and Joyce came close to relieving Dixon of his duties. As a result, only a small number of scenes were recorded that day, wasting a lot of time. J&T had now lost confidence in Joyce's ability to complete Warrior's Gate, and contemplated firing him. With Joyce having been so closely involved in developing the final drafts of the script, however, the producer decided to stick around with him. The final 2 days of the block remained fraught, even with Graham Harper taking a larger role in running the shoot. Despite losing even more time due to safety concerns with some of the sets, Joyce managed to squeeze in some TARDIS sequences on the last day. However, he remained far behind schedule. By the time the second 3-day block began in Studio 1 on October 2nd, the strenuous production was visibly taking its toll on Joyce. JNT too had come under fire from head of series and serials Graham MacDonald, expressing his concern about the situation. The relationship between Joyce and JNT had deteriorated to the point that the director was told that he was fired, only for the producer to relent a short time later. Despite the chaos surrounding the making of Warriors Gate, JNT was delighted with the finished serial. Joyce wrote to the producer to apologise for the whole debacle in January 1981, but JNT was effectively obliged to remove him from consideration for any future Doctor Who work. The tense production also deterred script editor Christopher H. Bidmead from extending his contract as script editor beyond season 18. He felt he was expanding too much time and energy on Doctor Who without suitable respect or reward. Terminus. As we enter the 1980s, we have Terminus, a serial plagued with problems. A power failure took place on the first recording day, delaying production by 2 hours, and when the crew was ready, they found that the set had been erected in the wrong place. Furthermore, the circuitry on the TARDIS console was missing, forcing director Mary Ridge to record scenes on other sets that weren't even correctly lit. Due to these delays, Terminus needed an extra hour of recording to complete the story. However, JNT informed Mary Ridge that an entire remount would have to be necessary. This caused upset for Sarah Sutton, who had already recorded her final scenes as Nyssa, but was required again for the remounted filming, causing serious frustration among the crew. Enlightenment. The following serial, Enlightenment, was followed by similar industrial action, resulting in an electrician strike. Originally planned to record in the studio in November 1982, the strike was already underway, causing a remount scheduled for January 1983. These recording dates were planned for the season 20 finale, The Return, which would have seen the return of the Daleks after a 4-year absence. Enlightenment was given priority, and The Return would be rescheduled for season 21. Due to the new filming dates, cast members had to be changed. Peter Sallis and David Rule had originally been cast as Stryker and Mansell, but these roles will now be played by Keith Barron and Lee John. Despite the tight schedule, Enlightenment was completed for transmission, albeit at the cost of its planned season finale. Warriors of the Deep. Yeah, now you know why I'd consider this story cursed, but let's see how we got here. In May 1983, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher called a snap election for June the 9th, taking advantage of her popularity in the wake of the Falklands War. The announcement caught BBC planning by surprise, and facilities had to be swiftly reallocated to accommodate election coverage. Amongst the casualties of this development was Warriors of the Deep. Nathan Turner was informed that the first studio block would have to be brought forward by a week, or else the serial would be cancelled. The decision was met with trepidation by visual effects department, however, with concern raised that the costume for the Merker could not be completed on schedule. The monster had been designed in the manner of a pantomime horse and required 2 operators, one positioned at either end of costume. The costume was supposed to be ready on June 23rd to give the performers an opportunity to rehearse with it before they went in front of the cameras the following afternoon. That day, however, the BBC Visual Effects Department informed JNT that the changes to the production schedule for Warriors of the Deep had left insufficient time to finish the Merker. Scenes involving the monster would have to be postponed to the second studio block. JNT informed Visual Effects that this was unacceptable. Given the constraints under which director Pennant Roberts was already operating, it was not possible to alter his plans to such an extent. He demanded that the Merker be made available for recording the next day, no matter what condition it was in. The results are pretty self-explanatory. Margaret Thatcher is a controversial figure, and it looks like we can blame her for Warriors of the Deep. Frontios. Frontios is a grim story, but the production itself was pretty gruesome to say the least. Barry Dobbins was given the job of designing Frontios. However, significant concerns arose regarding Dobbins' mental health, and so he was replaced by David Buckingham in early July. Sadly, Dobbins committed suicide soon thereafter. Dobbins' death was not the only tragedy which touched Frontios. As Mr. Range, Jones cast veteran actor Peter Arne. On August 1st, he had his costume fitting for Doctor Who and then returned home. Soon after, however, neighbours reported a violent argument in Arne's apartment, and the police arrived to find that he had been beaten to death. Several days later, a body was pulled from the Thames which was identified as that of a vagrant with whom Arne was acquainted. An inquest determined that the vagrant had murdered Arne and then drowned himself, although the motive was never made clear. Meanwhile, Ron Jones, the director, hastily recast the role of Mr. Range, with William Lucas taking Arne's place. The Ultimate Foe. It's a miracle that the trial of a Time Lord reached its verdict, given its circumstances. The original writer, Robert Holmes, was rushed to hospital in March 1986, where he would lapse into a coma. Shattered by this development, script editor Eric Sayward agreed to take over the unfinished script. The original ending for the trial would have been that the season end on a cliffhanger, with the Doctor and the Valiar being plunged to their deaths in the time vortex. Eric Sayward was infuriated to learn that JNT was now having misgivings about the downbeat ending. John Nathan Turner grown concerned that it would provide the BBC with a tailor-made scenario to cancel Doctor Who for good, and he felt that the viewers who had followed the season for 14 weeks were owed a genuine conclusion to the story. Efforts to reach a compromise proved futile, and Eric Sayward became concerned that JNT would go ahead and alter the scripts as he saw fit. Furthermore, he had heard reports of JNT bad-mouthing him to fans, and he was badly shaken by Holmes's death in May of 1986. As such, on June the 1st, Sayward withdrew his permission for the use of his version of episode 14. He attempted to do the same for the portion of episode 13 which he had written, but the BBC refused this request on the grounds that the work had been performed in Sayward's capacity as a script editor. With rehearsals set to begin in less than 2 weeks, JNT had to act quickly. He turned to Pip and Jane Baker, who had just written episodes 9 to 12 of Trial of a Time Lord at very short notice. On June the 4th, JNT dispatched the script for episode 13 to the Bakers via taxi. The next morning, he met with them at the Doctor Who production office. They were joined by a legal representative who were responsible for ensuring that JNT did not divulge any of the contents of Sayward's version of episode 14. This meant that the Bakers had to come up with their own way of tying together all the season's loose ends, without knowledge of the original plan. This serial was plagued by the death of a celebrated writer, a producer and script editor severing ties. How could it get worse? Well, by mid-October, the controller of BBC One, Michael Grade, gave JNT instructions to fire the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker. Colin was devastated by this news and refused to come back for a regeneration scene at the start of season 24. JNT was preparing himself for his exit from Doctor Who and expected to be moved on to a soap opera. On November the 28th, however, he was furious to learn from Jonathan Powell, head of series and serials, that he was being kept on Doctor Who for another year after Hall. He would have to cast a new Doctor, recruit a new script editor, and develop 14 episodes, all with the start of production barely 4 months away. The conversation between JNT and Jonathan Powell became so heated that he was apparently escorted out of his office by security. So what we ended up with was one man being very upset that he was being fired from Doctor Who, and another man very upset that he wasn't. The greatest show in the galaxy. Even Doctor Who's silver anniversary couldn't escape production issues. Whilst filming began relatively smoothly, disaster struck the studio recordings. Renovations in Television Centre Studio 2 uncovered the presence of asbestos, and traces of the dangerous material were subsequently detected in almost all of the other studios. BBC management was left with little choice but to suspend much of the Television Centre production schedule until asbestos abatement procedures could be completed. This meant that at a minimum, the first studio block for the greatest show in the galaxy would not be able to proceed in Studio 6 as planned. The second studio block was lost a week later. However, given that this story took place in a circus tent, the crew came up with a pretty good solution. Erect a tent within the BBC Elstree car park and film all these circus scenes in there. Just goes to show how improvising on the spot can help sometimes, as the results are one of the best Doctor Who stories ever made. Battlefield. Even in its final year, Doctor Who wasn't without its issues. Of course am referring to the sequence where Ace became trapped in the airlock, which then began filling with water. What no one on the crew realised, however, was that the glass used for the tank was not of the appropriate thickness. Once water was being pumped in, with Sophie Aldred hammering on it from the inside, the prop began to lose its structural integrity. Fortunately, as cracks spidered across the glass, Sylvester McCoy realised what was happening and alerted stagehands to the danger. Sophie Aldred was pulled clear just as the glass shattered and water poured out over the studio floor. The actress did suffer some glass splinters in her hands, but was otherwise unhurt. Nevertheless, tabloid coverage sensationalised the incident, suggesting that Aldred had barely managed to escape and cheated death. Footage of the mishap would later be used in BBC safety training videos. Hey, at least they learned their lesson. So that's it when it comes to cursed and troubled Doctor Who productions. Let me know in the comments what your favourite and most interesting stories from this video are, and if I missed any, let me know, and I shall see you all next time. Goodbye.